All right, welcome back to the Philip Rosenberg Show. I am, of course, Philip Rosenberg, and I am here with Randy Otto, a unique figure in the world of acting slash history where these two worlds meet. Randy, Mr. Otto, is an impersonator of one of my favorite characters from history, Winston Churchill. He embodies the character, as you'll see, and we're going to talk to him. He's going to come at us from World War II, from the 1930s, from the 1920s. We may go further back than that even. Enjoy this wonderful experience. Thank you so much, Randy, for being with us. And Mr. Churchill, allow me to really, really thank you deeply for taking the time out to spend with me.
My dear Philip, it's so good to speak with you again. And I have all of the time in the world, my friend.
Oh, thank you. So most of the world knows you as the hero of the United Kingdom and the West, and they start thinking about you as the opponent of Adolf Hitler. But you have a long history before World War II in the military, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking about some of that, because that's the kind of thing a lot of people don't know. So when did you get in? When did you enter the military, and what was your experience like prior to the Battle of Britain, World War II?
Of course, it seemed like I was destined to be a part of the military. My father walked into a room in which I was playing. I had over 1,500 toy soldiers made out of tin. They were beautiful, of course, red and blue. And I had the Battle of Blenheim that was fought by my famous ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, and won, of course, against Louis XIV back in 1704. Had it all spread out there on the floor. And my father entered the room very quietly and was observing. And he cleared his throat. And I turned and he said, "So, Winston, a career in the military then?" And not wanting to displease him, of course, I said, "Well, yes, Papa, I'd like that very much." "Very well, it's settled then." And he turned on his heel and left the room. And so it was destined that I should become a part of the military from that moment on.
Do you remember the first time you were ever in a heated battle?
I do.
Can you tell us about that? Were you afraid?
It was in India. Actually, we were fighting the Pashtun tribes in what you today would call Pakistan. And a group of us were part of what we called the Malakand Field Force. I wrote a book, my very first book, as a matter of fact, was entitled The Malakand Field Force, based upon my recounting for the newspapers in London. I would send dispatches back of these battles. And in the very first battle, one of the very first ones, I saw a man cut to ribbons, literally, by the Pashtun tribes. They were merciless. And of course, when you are in the heat of battle, you don't think about those things until later, and they impress you. And so I would write these things, and of course, I would ride a white horse into battle because I wanted to be noticed. You see, most of us Churchills died young, and I felt I was a man in a hurry. I needed to make a mark for myself, so I rode a white horse into battle. Of course, it was a very good target, and I learned during that battle and many others that it is exhilarating to be shot at without result.
Indeed. Okay, let me ask you this. What battle, if you could change any of your decisions that you made as a military strategist, as a leader of men, what decision do you think you would undo if you could?
Well, there was one very simple decision, and that revolved around the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles affair. You see, we attacked the soft underbelly of Europe in Turkey. We were bogged down in the trenches, of course, in France, Belgium, the rest of it. And we needed another front. We felt we could bring the Balkans, perhaps bring the Russians more fully in. and open another front, take the oil fields away from them, and shorten the war by at least a year. I was in charge of the Admiralty, out of the Navy at the time, and I learned from that battle to not take charge or attempt to take charge if you do not fully have control over the situation. And I did not. And it failed miserably. It became, of course, as some of your viewers may know, the worst, most horrible event, defeat in British history.
Military history.
Over 55,000 men died, and over 250,000 wounded or injured. And so that would be the decision I would make. And I learned it in World War II. I made myself Minister for War, and I took charge along with my war cabinet, and we ran it very tightly, and we didn't let the generals take over. That was the key. Hope that answers your question.
It does indeed. So let us fast forward now from World War II, just 10 years, 15 years, and we start to see the threat in Europe grow again from essentially the same place. Instead of the Austro-Hungarians, we have the Austrians and the Italians, and of course the Germans.
Right.
And the dispute over Alsace and Lorraine between the French and Germans. And the Versailles Treaty, which many people have come to count as an oppression more than a fair ending to a war. And so we see the rise of German nationalism.
Indeed.
And the reaction from the British government at the time, Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, was somewhat passive. How did you feel about that? And can you talk about his decisions and how you might have, if you disagree with them, how you might have acted differently?
And the passive approach did not work with the Germans, did it? An appeaser is like a man who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. And that was, unfortunately, dear Neville ran into, if you will, the most evil man who ever lived. This, Philip, was a war that could have been avoided. I called it the unnecessary war. If only we had stood up to this madman at any time, especially you mentioned Alsace-Lorraine. They walked into Alsace-Lorraine and no one said a word. We just let them take it. The French let them take it. How could they have done it? And of course, we all had this Treaty of Versailles, and everyone wanted to have a meeting about it. Oh, let's just and perhaps we should draft some sort of doctrine opposing the invasion of Alsace-Lorraine. But it was a fait accompli, was it not? The same thing happened, of course, in Austria. And then the Munich Treaty, Neville with a piece of paper, peace in our time. Let's just give them a piece of Czechoslovakia. Later on, while I was with Stalin at his birthday at one of our conferences, we were drinking toasts to Premier Stalin all night long, and I refused to give a toast until my aide said to me, Mr. Churchill, Mr. Prime Minister, you must give a toast. They're waiting for you. So I stood and I said, ladies and gentlemen, to Premier Stalin, a man who desires peace. And as I sat down, I said, a piece of Czechoslovakia, a piece of Poland, a piece of Hungary, and all the rest of it. Yes, it was funny, but it was deadly serious because, of course, when Germany invaded Poland, we were bound by treaty of France and England to defend Poland. But what did we have? We had nothing. We were not prepared. And so all we could do was stand and watched on that September day, September the 1st of 1939, and watch as the Poles were decimated. And the Russians stood by and watched, didn't they?
Well, by some counts, they even assisted
Indeed.
the Nazis. Do they not
They
in far
they
eastern
wanted their
Poland?
they wanted their piece of Poland, didn't they? And they got it.
That is the story.
Mm.
The Poles are not in a contemporary. They were not very pleased to have been placed behind the Iron Curtain just after the war. We'll get to that. I know you had some thoughts on that. So I guess I'm gonna guess that you would like to contact. I would like to know who you would like to send a letter to from your past, and what would be in that letter. And I wonder if that person will be, given your previous answer, will that be Neville Chamberlain? If it's someone else, well, let's see. Who would you like to write to? What would you say to them?
You know, I've given great thought about that subject. I wrote a book in actually I told a story to my family. It was called The Dream, and I believe the International Churchill Society has published it. And it is a letter, really, to my father. My father died, of course, in 1895 at the age of 45. Very young man. I never really got to know him. And I mused in this little book that I wrote, a very slim volume called The Dream. I would recommend to your listeners, perhaps that you get a copy of it. It's a lovely little poem, if you will. And in this book, I'm painting in my studio, Chartwell, over 550 oil paintings in my lifetime. But this particular evening, I was copying in my story, copying a portrait of my father. And I looked down, and my ash fell into my paints. And I looked up, and there was my father sitting there in the chair, in this red leather chair, which is still at Chartwell. You can see it today. And you can see his torn portrait that I was attempting to recreate. And in a very timeless piece of time, my father and I had a conversation about what had happened from 1895 through 1946. And I told him, of course, about the First World War, the Second World War, all the rest of it, the rise of Hitler. And at the end of it, my father shook his head, looked round, and said, "You know, Winston, it's amazing that you've become a painter. You could have been a decent politician." And he disappeared in a puff of smoke. Now, I told this story round the table to my family. That's where it began. And it was formalized into a book. And so if I could go back in time and write a letter, I would write it to my father and tell him how much I owed him, how much I loved him, and how much I wished he had seen me in World War II, the culmination, politically and personally, of what he had hoped for, what we all hope for with our children.
Do you have a favorite speech that you've given? What is your favorite bit of dialogue that you've delivered to the public?
Well, the 80th anniversary of that speech occurred just the 13th of May, just a few days ago, sir. And it went something like this. I should say to the House, and I have said to those gathered here, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. You ask, what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war on the land, on the sea, and in the air with all our might, with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never before encountered in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can say it in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there can be no survival.
All right. Speaking of victory and surviving and terror, let me ask you a somewhat difficult question now.
I'll be the judge of that.
we know that many gypsies, homosexuals, Jews, political dissenters, anyone that disagreed with Adolf Hitler would pay the price.
Mm.
Do you think that the UK during World War II could have, should have done more to help those people that were suffering?
We dearly wanted to, my dear Philip, especially when we discovered the final solution had been enacted in 1942. The complete annihilation of the Jewish race from the face of the earth, along with the priests, as you said, homosexuals, those who were not pure, not part of the Aryan race. It was insidious, was it not? Of course it was. But what could we do? We were in the middle of it. And so were the concentration camps, my dear Philip. How could we get at them? Could we send commandos? Some have questioned, I have heard, in the past, my relations with the Jewish race, with the Jewish society, if you will, the Jewish people around the world. Now, when I became prime minister, Henry Struckos, a Polish Jewish businessman, dear friend, came to me and said, Mr. Churchill, I understand you are deeply in debt because you took a stand for the last 10 years. You have not been allowed to be published, not allowed to be recorded. You've been a man crying in the wilderness, if you will, and you've amassed a great deal of debt, £1 million at that time, a substantial sum. And he told me he would retire my debt because he did not want the leader of freedom, the leader that would rescue his people, eventually, to be impaired financially in any way. If that is not, I'm sorry, I'm overcome with it because
I quite understand. It must have been one of those moments in your life that you go back to and ask yourself, might I have done something? Could I have? I wish I could have, but I couldn't.
I wish we could have, Philip, but it was unfeasible at the time. I am only deeply happy and deeply grateful that we were able to rescue as many as we did at the end of the war.
Allow me to provide a little bit of relief if this helps you at all. There are many who would say that without the Holocaust, Israel would not exist today. That without the sense of guilt that the world had at that time in 1948 and before, that Israel would not have had the votes it needed in the United Nations to be recognized as an independent nation. And so, if you're one of those people that has that perception, then you might consider the sacrifice made and made well.
As one of the founding members of the United Nations, and very, very happy and very much behind the Israeli homeland being established, I must agree with you that it finally, unfortunately, brought to light the great contributions of the Jewish people around the world that they have made not only to society, but certainly to the very fiber of this world that we live in. We would not be where we are without the perspicacity and the knowledge that you brought. It's astonishing. You know,
Must
friend,
define that word. You must define that word, perspicacity.
perspicacity. Well, chutzpah. How's that sound? There's a synonym for you.
Word I would understand well.
Indeed.
All right, Mr. Churchill, I want to thank you so much for joining me this evening. It has, of course, been an absolute pleasure. Folks at home, thank you for tuning in on YouTube. Let me ask you this, Mr. Churchill. If my listeners and viewers want to get in touch with you, if they're interested in having further conversations, having you come talk to groups of people on politics of the time, how might they reach out to you?
I would love an entreaty from anyone. You may go to a place called churchillspeaker.com.
Very good.
churchillspeaker.com.
Churchillspeaker.com.
And I would welcome. I have a little box there that's called Ask Winston. You have a question, a comment, anything you'd like to know about me, Winston, or about my alter ego personally, I would welcome it. Philip, it has been a delight, as always, to visit with you. You are a true professional, my friend.
Thank you very much. Folks at home, I want to thank you for joining me. This has been Winston Churchill, a.k.a. Randy Otto. Thank you, Randy, for joining us. Tune in again. We're going to be interviewing someone in a couple of days talk more about the chess world, what's happening in New York City and around the world. Thanks, folks. Have a wonderful weekend.